Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Today, the 63rd Governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour. In 2003, Mr. Barbour was elected Governor of Mississippi, becoming only the second Republican to do so since Reconstruction. In 2007, he won re-election to a second and, because of term limits, final term. Since June of last year, Governor Barbour has served as chairman of the Republican Governors Association. An item in Politico this very week referred to him in his capacity as chairman of the Republican Governors Association as, quote, the most powerful man in Republican politics, close quote. First question, Governor. You grew up in Mississippi at a time when the term the Solid South still meant the solidly Democratic South. 21, 22 years old, you skipped out on a semester at Ole Miss to go to work on the 1968 campaign of Republican Richard Nixon, and you've been in Republican politics ever since. What possessed you?
Well, to be a Republican in Mississippi in 1968, Peter, you did have to take the long-term view. First time I ever saw a poll was during the 1968 campaign. I'd never seen a political poll, but that year, 6% of Mississippians identified themselves as Republicans. 6. Now, Nixon didn't do well in Mississippi in 1968 because of George Wallace. But in 1972, it was his highest percentage of the vote in the country for Nixon. But more importantly, we elected 2 young Republican congressmen in 1972, Trent Lott and Thad Cochran. Both became giants in the Senate, and today we have not only a Republican governor, but 7 of our 8 state elected officials are Republicans, and both of our United States senators. So I don't know what possessed me other than my oldest brother came home from the Army, a Goldwater Republican, in 1965, and in that spring of '68, he ran for mayor of Yazoo City, Mississippi, quit his job at the bank, and the Republicans didn't have a line on the ballot, so he had to run as an independent. We had to get a petition so that he could get on the ballot, but I got a kick out of it. So I dropped out of college, as you said. I was at Ole Miss, and I dropped out the fall of my senior year to work in the presidential campaign. I wouldn't give anything for it.
Your brother was the influence. Your dad died when you were a little boy, as I recall.
My daddy died when I was 2 years old. My dad was a Democratic elected official. His daddy was a Democratic elected official. He was a circuit judge, and we were Eastland Democrats. There was a senator from Mississippi named Jim Eastland, and my grandfather was Mr. Eastland's daddy's lawyer. It's a pretty small state, and was a real small state in the 1930s and 40s. So even though we went back that way, I've always thought if my father had lived to 1970 or 1980, that he would have become a Republican. His little brother, who was my senior law partner, did. Interestingly, my parents' generation became Republicans after their children became Republicans.
Haley, excuse me, I should call you governor. We've better stipulate we've known each other for a long time, but you're the governor. And
people have been calling me Haley a whole lot longer than they call me governor. So, Peter, you can call me whatever you want to.
All right. Well, let's take this on right away. 1968, there's still talk about Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, and that the reason that white folks in the South, Mississippi, the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, that they became Republican was race. It was a reaction against the Civil Rights Acts and the advances that African Americans were making in the South.
Well, there's no question that in the 50s and probably in the 60s there was some of that. At the same time, the people that led the change of parties in the South, just as I mentioned earlier, was my generation.
Right.
My generation who went to integrated schools, or I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it. And it was the old Democrats who had fought for segregation so hard. By my time, people realized that was the past. It was indefensible. It wasn't going to be that way anymore. And so the people who really changed the South from Democrat to Republican was a different generation from those who fought integration. In fact, I can never forget when I mentioned we elected these 2 young congressmen, and we were just itching to get a senator. And one of my friends said, well, Haley, we're just a few funerals away. That you had some of the old crowd that just wasn't ever going to give up on the Democratic Party because it was the party of the Civil War, segregation. And some of those people gave up on it, and a lot of those people just aren't here anymore.
Haley, our governor, you ran for the Senate yourself in 1982. You lost by about 2.5 or 3 to 1 because your opponent was John Cornelius Stennis, who has an aircraft carrier named after him, was a legendary figure in the Senate and one of the great men of Mississippi. And one of the Democrats you're talking about, is that roughly when the generational change is taking place? There's young Haley Barbour stepping forward as a Republican, and there's John Stennis as a representative of the Old South. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It's kind of a pivot point. Actually, I got to be 64 to 36, but I never expected your math to be very good. But that's not new. And Senator Stennis was a revered person. Yes, he was a segregationist, but he wasn't mean. He wasn't somebody who was waved the bloody shirt. He did what his generation did. And when I ran against him in 1982, we were in the transition. We weren't anything like a Republican state. Ronald Reagan carried Mississippi in 1980 with 51% of the vote.
Oh, was it that close?
Yes, sir. And by 1984,
I had not remembered that.
Back to 84, it blew out the top.
Right.
But it was sort of the transition that ran from the late 60s when we were minuscule, that by the 80s we were starting to become competitive. And then as we went through the 80s and 90s, the Democrats started receding. And as I say, part of it was demographic because a lot of old people who had stayed faithful to the Democratic Party weren't there anymore. And a couple of other things, urbanization, industrialization, really homogenization. You know, Jackson, Mississippi became a whole lot more like Jackson, Michigan than it had ever been before. Interstates, McDonald's, you could, you know.
The South joined the rest of the United States in some way.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you at the same time, the United States became more like the South. It was a two-way, like most things in life, it was a two-way transition.